Was Mary Magdalene Jesus's chosen successor rather than Peter? Did Jesus entrust her with secret teachings too radical for the other disciples? Was the early church's rejection of this gospel a calculated move to suppress women's spiritual authority? The Gospel of Mary raises these explosive questions that challenge the very foundations of traditional Christianity. This ancient text, discovered in 1896 but dating to the early 2nd century, portrays Mary Magdalene not as a reformed prostitute or minor follower, but as Jesus's most trusted confidant and spiritual heir. Even more controversially, it suggests Jesus deliberately concealed his most profound teachings from his male disciples, sharing them only with Mary, a detail that could rewrite our understanding of early Christianity's power dynamics. Perhaps most provocatively, the Gospel contains a heated exchange where Peter and Andrew openly challenge Mary's authority because of her gender, revealing that battles over women's roles in the church have raged since Christianity's earliest days and weren't merely modern concerns as traditionalists often claim. The Gospel of Mary presents a revolutionary portrayal of Mary Magdalene that fundamentally challenges traditional understandings of Jesus's inner circle. Unlike the canonical Gospels where Mary plays a significant but limited role, this text elevates her to an unprecedented position as Jesus's most intimate confidant and spiritual heir. The fragmentary nature of the surviving manuscript makes this all the more intriguing. We glimpse a radically different power structure within Jesus's followers than what eventually became Orthodox Christianity. The text opens after Jesus's resurrection and departure, with the disciples in a state of despair and uncertainty. It is Mary who steps forward to comfort them, saying, "Do not weep and do not grieve, nor be irresolute, for his grace will be entirely with you and will protect you." This establishes her immediately as a figure of authority and reassurance. Peter then makes a remarkable request. "Sister, we know that the Savior loved you more than the rest of women. Tell us the words of the Savior which you remember, which you know but we do not, nor have we heard them." This statement is extraordinary in several respects. First, Peter, traditionally viewed as the rock upon which Jesus built his church, explicitly acknowledges that Mary possessed special knowledge from Jesus that the male disciples did not. Second, he recognizes that Jesus had a particular affection for Mary that exceeded his relationships with other women followers. This creates a hierarchical inversion where Peter, despite his prominence in the canonical tradition, must turn to Mary for guidance and instruction. What follows is even more striking. Mary begins to tell them of a vision she received from Jesus, saying, "I saw the Lord in a vision, and I said to him, 'Lord, I saw you today in a vision.'" She then proceeds to relate complex spiritual teachings about the nature of vision, the mind, and the soul's journey. The text suggests these were private revelations, secret teachings not shared with the wider group of disciples. This positions Mary not just as a follower, but as an initiate into deeper mysteries, trusted with esoteric knowledge too profound for general dissemination. The fragmentary nature of the manuscript means we've lost significant portions of Mary's vision. About 10 pages are missing from the middle section. This tantalizing gap leaves us wondering about the full extent of the secret teachings Mary received. When the text resumes, Mary is describing a complex cosmological journey of the soul as it ascends through various levels of reality, confronting and overcoming hostile powers. This Gnostic-flavored revelation suggests that Jesus entrusted Mary with profound metaphysical insights that went beyond the more accessible moral and practical teachings found in the canonical Gospels. This special relationship between Jesus and Mary raises provocative questions about intimacy and authority in the early Jesus movement. Some scholars have suggested the text implies a romantic or sexual relationship between Jesus and Mary, though the Gospel itself never explicitly states this. What it does unambiguously assert is a spiritual intimacy. Jesus chose Mary as the repository for his most profound teachings, suggesting he recognized in her a superior capacity for spiritual understanding. The reaction of the male disciples to Mary's revelations further illuminates her unique status. After she finishes speaking, Andrew responds skeptically, saying, "Say what you wish to say about what she has said. I at least do not believe that the Savior said this." For certainly these teachings are strange ideas. Peter then more directly challenges her authority. Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? This confrontation reveals the gender dynamics at play. Peter's objection is not primarily about the content of Mary's teaching, but about her gender. He questions whether Jesus would have chosen a woman for special revelation over the male disciples. This suggests that Mary's authority posed a direct challenge to emerging patriarchal structures within the early Christian community. Levi's defense of Mary is equally telling. Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Levi's intervention frames the issue in terms of worthiness and divine selection. Jesus chose Mary because he recognized her spiritual capacity. This suggests a meritocratic rather than gender-based understanding of spiritual authority that would have been radical for its time. The text concludes with Levi encouraging the disciples to preach the gospel, not laying down any other rule or other law beyond what the Savior said. This could be interpreted as a call to preserve the inclusivity of Jesus' original movement against emerging hierarchical structures. The historical context of the Gospel of Mary adds further layers to our understanding of Mary's unique relationship with Jesus. Composed probably in the early 2nd century, the text emerged during a period when various Christian groups were competing to claim authentic inheritance of Jesus' legacy. By positioning Mary as Jesus' most trusted disciple, the gospel legitimizes a strand of Christianity that may have emphasized direct mystical experience over institutional authority and possibly one that recognized women's leadership. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that women did indeed hold leadership positions in some early Christian communities. Inscriptions and texts refer to women deacons, prophets, and patrons. The Gospel of Mary may reflect this historical reality while also providing theological justification for women's spiritual authority by rooting it in Jesus' own actions and preferences. The most tantalizing aspect of the Gospel of Mary lies in the mysterious teachings Jesus supposedly shared with Mary alone, revelations so profound and controversial that they were kept from the other disciples. What exactly were these secret teachings, and why were they considered too dangerous or advanced for general consumption? Unfortunately, the most critical section of the manuscript has been lost to history. Approximately 6 pages are missing precisely where Mary begins to reveal Jesus' private instructions. This gap has fueled centuries of speculation and intrigue. What teachings were so explosive that they needed to be shared in secret? And why was Mary the sole recipient? When the text resumes after this significant gap, Mary is describing a complex vision of the soul's ascent through various cosmic realms. She explains how the soul encounters and overcomes 4 spiritual powers: darkness, desire, ignorance, and wrath of death, that attempt to bind it to the material world. This cosmological journey concludes with the soul declaring triumphantly, I have been released from the world and from the chain of forgetfulness that exists in time. These teachings bear striking resemblance to Gnostic concepts that flourished in some early Christian communities, ideas that were eventually labeled heretical by the emerging Orthodox Church. The Gnostic worldview typically emphasized direct spiritual knowledge, gnosis, over faith, viewed the material world as an imperfect or corrupt creation, and sought liberation through recognizing one's divine nature imprisoned in physical form. What makes these teachings particularly controversial is how radically they differ from the doctrine that would eventually become Orthodox Christianity. There is no mention of Jesus' sacrificial death atoning for humanity's sins. Instead, salvation comes through self-knowledge and spiritual awakening. There is no emphasis on Jesus' physical resurrection. Rather, his importance lies in the wisdom he imparts. There is no reference to an apocalyptic second coming or final judgment. Instead, the focus is on the individual soul's journey toward liberation. In one of the most striking passages, the text presents Jesus as teaching, "There is no sin, but it is you who make sin when you do the things that are like the nature of adultery, which is called sin." This provocative statement suggests a completely different understanding of sin than the one that became dominant in Christianity. not as transgression against divine law, but as a form of confusion or attachment to material reality. Such a teaching undermines the need for institutional forgiveness or mediation by clergy, potentially threatening ecclesiastical authority. The secret teachings also emphasize the primacy of inner experience over external authority. When Peter asks Mary about things which we have not heard, she responds with a vision that came directly to her, not through apostolic succession or institutional channels. This validates personal revelation as a legitimate source of spiritual knowledge, a potentially subversive concept in a developing religion increasingly concerned with establishing orthodoxy and controlling access to divine truth. Equally significant is what these teachings suggest about Jesus himself. Rather than the apocalyptic prophet or divine sacrifice portrayed in canonical texts, the Gospel of Mary presents Jesus as a wisdom teacher sharing esoteric knowledge with specially prepared initiates. This aligns more closely with mystery traditions of the Greco-Roman world than with Jewish messianic expectations or the developing Christology of Orthodox Christianity. The reaction of the male disciples to Mary's revelations is telling. Andrew expresses disbelief, saying these teachings are strange ideas, while Peter more explicitly questions whether Jesus would have shared such knowledge privately with a woman. Their skepticism may reflect actual historical tensions within early Christian communities over these more mystical, Gnostic interpretations of Jesus' message. It suggests that even in the early 2nd century, when this gospel was likely composed, there were competing visions of Christianity, one more mystical and egalitarian, another more institutional and hierarchical. Levi's defense of Mary is equally significant. He does not argue for the validity of her teachings based on their content, but on Jesus' recognition of her spiritual worthiness. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? This implies that spiritual insight is not determined by gender or position but by inner capacity, a radically egalitarian notion that threatened emerging power structures. Why would such teachings be shared only with Mary? The text itself provides no explicit answer, but several possibilities emerge. Perhaps these mystical teachings were considered too advanced for general dissemination, reserved for those with special spiritual capacity. Perhaps they were seen as potentially destabilizing to the developing church hierarchy. Or perhaps, as some feminist scholars have suggested, they represented an alternative strand of Christianity that recognized women's spiritual authority, a tradition deliberately suppressed as male-dominated institutional structures gained ascendancy. The historical context adds another layer of complexity. The Gospel of Mary emerged during a period of intense competition among various Christian groups, each claiming authentic inheritance of Jesus' legacy. By the time the canon was being formalized in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, texts emphasizing direct spiritual knowledge and questioning hierarchical authority, particularly those elevating women's spiritual leadership, were increasingly marginalized as heretical. The secret teachings in the Gospel of Mary thus offer a fascinating glimpse into roads not taken in Christian development, mystical rather than institutional, focused on inner transformation rather than external salvation, and possibly more open to women's spiritual leadership. Their eventual exclusion from Orthodox tradition speaks volumes about the theological and political forces that shaped Christianity as we know it today. The Gospel of Mary doesn't just offer alternative theological concepts, it provides a remarkable window into the gender politics of early Christianity, revealing tensions and power struggles that have largely been erased from the canonical record. This ancient text presents what may be the most explicit portrayal of gender conflict in any early Christian document, suggesting that battles over women's roles in the church have raged since Christianity's earliest days. The climactic scene comes after Mary finishes sharing her vision. Rather than accepting her revelation with gratitude, two of Jesus' closest male disciples openly challenge her authority. Andrew speaks first, declaring, "Say what you wish to say about what she has said. I at least do not believe that the Savior said this. For certainly these teachings are strange ideas." His objection appears focused on the content of Mary's teaching, dismissing it as too unusual to have come from Jesus. Peter's response, however, cuts to the heart of the gender issue. Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? This remarkable statement lays bare the gender-based power dynamics at play. Peter doesn't merely question the content of Mary's revelation. He questions whether Jesus would have entrusted important teachings to a woman at all, and whether men should accept spiritual instruction from a female authority. This confrontation is extraordinarily valuable for understanding early Christianity's internal struggles. While the canonical Gospels occasionally show the disciples misunderstanding Jesus, they never explicitly portray gender-based conflicts over authority and leadership. The Gospel of Mary suggests that some early Christian communities experienced significant tension over women's roles, with male leaders resistant to female spiritual authority despite Jesus' apparent endorsement of it. Mary's response to this challenge is equally telling. She weeps. "Do not think that I am lying about the Savior," she says to Peter. Her emotional reaction suggests this was not an abstract theological debate, but a painful personal attack questioning her integrity and relationship with Jesus. This human moment captures the real cost of such gender conflicts for the women involved. The resolution comes through Levi, who defends Mary against Peter's criticisms. "Peter, you've always been hot-tempered. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us." This intervention shifts the focus from gender to worthiness, suggesting that spiritual authority should be based on one's capacity for understanding rather than social categories like gender. Levi concludes with a call to action. "But if the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Rather, let us be ashamed and put on the perfect man and acquire him for ourselves as he commanded us, and preach the gospel, not laying down any other rule or other law beyond what the Savior said." This passage is remarkable for several reasons. First, it explicitly acknowledges that Jesus may have recognized spiritual capacities in Mary that exceeded those of his male disciples. Second, it suggests that rejecting Mary's authority means rejecting Jesus' own judgment. And third, it calls for a return to Jesus' original inclusive vision, uncorrupted by additional rules or laws, potentially a criticism of emerging hierarchical structures that limited women's participation. Archaeological and historical evidence confirms that women did indeed hold leadership positions in some early Christian communities. Inscriptions refer to women deacons, prophets, and patrons of house churches. Paul's letters mention women co-workers like Phoebe, Prisca, and Eunia. The Gospel of Mary may reflect this historical reality while also providing theological justification for women's leadership by rooting it in Jesus' own actions and preferences. The eventual marginalization of this gospel, along with other texts that portrayed women in leadership roles, parallels the historical diminishment of women's authority in the developing church. As Christianity moved from house churches to more formal institutional structures in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, women's leadership roles became increasingly restricted. By the time the canon was being formalized, texts emphasizing women's spiritual authority were increasingly labeled heretical. This pattern of suppression continued through the centuries. When Church Father Tertullian wrote about women who presumed to teach, to engage in argument, to enact exorcisms, and even to baptize, he was not describing a theoretical possibility, but a real practice he found deeply troubling. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century explicitly forbade women from serving at the altar. The trajectory is clear. What may have been an open question in Jesus' time, and the early church became increasingly closed as institutional structures solidified. The Gospel of Mary thus preserves evidence of a critical moment in Christian history, when alternative models of authority based on spiritual capacity rather than gender were still possible, and when women's leadership was still contested rather than definitively suppressed. The text doesn't just tell us that such conflicts existed. It shows us how they played out, what arguments were used on both sides, and what was at stake. This ancient text reminds us that Christianity has always contained multiple visions of gender and authority. The dominant tradition emphasized hierarchy, with male authority justified through appeals to creation order, apostolic succession, and selected scriptural passages. But alternative strands emphasized spiritual giftedness over gender, direct revelation over institutional authority, and Jesus' own relationships with women as models for church practice. The Gospel of Mary stands as a powerful witness to roads not taken in Christian development, paths that might have led to more egalitarian structures and fuller recognition of women's spiritual capacities. Its rediscovery in the modern era challenges contemporary Christians to reconsider whether the traditional limitations on women's roles reflect Jesus' original vision or later institutional developments that Mary herself might have questioned. For modern readers across religious and secular perspectives, the Gospel of Mary provides valuable insight into the diversity of early Christianity and the processes by which certain voices, particularly women's voices, were marginalized in the formation of Orthodox tradition. It reminds us that what we now consider normative was once deeply contested, and that history might have unfolded differently had alternative visions prevailed.